Moving to Live is a podcast about movement and exercise. We bring you interviews with professionals in the movement and exercise field. The goal is to provide information for other professionals and also amateur movement aficionados, people who understand that movement is part of what makes life complete. Some of the people we interview you will have heard of. They're well known in and outside of the movement and exercise profession. Others you may not have heard of, but they have a great deal of knowledge to share. Many people doing the best work spend their time working with people, not working on their social media presence. We're going to give you a chance to learn from some of these talented and knowledgeable individuals, and we're going to learn along with you. Moving to Live podcasts are going to be short. Each interview will be long enough to impart usable information, but short enough to be able to be consumed in a single bout, during your workout, commute, or even during dinner prep. We all like long-form interviews, but time is valuable. Moving to Live wants to give you the option to learn and be entertained without needing to commit 60 minutes at a time for an interview. Give Moving to Live a listen. Check out our sister podcast, FitLab PGH, which highlights people, businesses, events, and activities in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area that make movement a priority. Moving to Live would love to hear from you. Want to connect with us or have an idea for somebody you think we ought to interview? Drop us an email, mov2liv@gmail.com, or connect with us on Instagram and Twitter, both _mov2liv. We're excited to bring you these interviews, and we think you'll enjoy each and every one that we bring you. Welcome back to another Moving to Live podcast. As you know, the ethos of Moving to Live and our sister podcast, FitLab PGH, is movement is a lifestyle, not just an activity. With Moving to Live, we're for movement professionals, amateur aficionados. Our goal is to break down those knowledge silos. So no matter what movement field you're in, you kind of get an idea what other people are doing in other movement fields and possibly pick up something that you can use with your patients, your clients, your subjects if you're a researcher. A big shout out to Lisa McFadden of Sanford Health. She is a bioengineer, has a doctorate in that, and we interviewed her on an earlier interview. And one of the things we ask everybody that we interview is, hey, who would you recommend for an interview? So she recommended our guest today. Make sure I get the pronunciation right. Melissa Boswell and Hannah O'Day, who are not only biomechanics PhD students at Stanford University, but they also have their own podcast, which is Biomechanics on My Mind, or BOOM. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll find their story. Hannah, Melissa, thanks for taking time to talk to Moving to Live.
Thanks. Well, you nailed the name pronunciations. It's actually Biomechanics on Our Minds.
And I'm looking at that on my screen,
yes.
and I
that would
misread
be
it.
Bomb if it was on my mind.
Yeah, it's kind of
pretty great.
Close.
And that's where you look at the Google page and you just gloss over it. But my favorite thing to start out with Moving to Live, and we'll ask Hannah first, I'll flip around between the two of you, is you're on an elevator. You've got a name tag on at a conference, or maybe you've got a Stanford University t-shirt on, and somebody says, what do you do? What's your 30-second spiel to describe what you are?
All right, are you timing me?
I'm not timing you. That's 30 seconds. I'll cut you off in 30 seconds unless it's very interesting.
Okay, well, I am lucky enough to be a PhD student at Stanford working with a neurologist, Dr. Helen Bronte-Stewart, and a biomechanist, Professor Scott Delp. And altogether, we study people with Parkinson's and how they walk, and then try to understand both biomechanically and neurally why they might have impaired walking, and then design better therapies to fix that.
And as anybody who has done a PhD or knows somebody going for a PhD, there's always a question that gets asked where there's two answers. The first question, or the question is, when do you hope to be finished, or when do you realistically plan to be finished? And I think the correct answer is, if all goes as, or the correct question is, if all goes as planned, when do you anticipate being finished with your PhD?
That is a great question, which is how I like to answer most questions when I don't want to think too hard about the answer. But realistically, the goal is this June, and then with everything that's going on, I think I'm okay with it being next fall as well.
And then is the goal eventually to do teaching and research, private industry, still to be decided? Don't ask me that yet.
I actually feel like I have the problem of wanting to do everything. So I would love to work in private industry for a medical device company is sort of the space I think I'd like to be in, working at the interface between patients and the engineers or the product. And then if I were to stay in academia, I think I would lean more toward teaching.
So subject to change, of course, at any time, we all know. And Melissa,
change, exactly.
What about you? What's your elevator spiel or description? This is who I am. This is what I do.
Sure. Yeah. So I am also a PhD student at Stanford in the neuromuscular biomechanics lab with Scott Delp. I also collaborate with the Mind and Body lab, who is head by Aaliyah Crum in psychology. And my research is focused on improving the accessibility and adherence to conservative movement interventions, specifically for knee osteoarthritis. So I like to not just think about how we can move better, but how we're thinking about movement and our motivation for being physically active and how we can get people to enjoy being physically active more.
And I think that's something that's really come to the forefront in the middle of COVID and everything, getting people to enjoy, especially with facilities partially closed, permanently closing. And the question, just like I asked Hannah, when is your anticipated completion date? And as a follow-up to that, what do you think, or what are your thoughts on what you'll do after graduation?
Yeah, starting with the hard questions here. I think for me, I'm hoping to graduate by the end of next year. And then after that, I'm not sure yet. Similar to Hannah, I love this idea of human-centered research and really disseminating information about that and helping others do more human-centered research. I also love teaching. I do consulting in industry and I love that. So who knows, I like the idea of traveling somewhere new too. So I'm just going to apply to all sorts of things and see where it takes me.
And I know I would be mad at myself if I didn't ask both of you this question. And this is either for both of you or one of you, but clearly we're doing this interview in the middle of October, and everybody across the world's life has changed significantly since March. If you look at last October versus this October, how have your doctoral studies differed, say, from what you were doing last October versus this October, as far as the management and what's going on with COVID in the state of California?
That's such a good question. I feel like I've been really fortunate in that a lot of my research can be done remotely, but you just miss that interaction with people. I miss that energy, that creative energy of just like bouncing ideas off of each other, actually getting on the whiteboard and doing things. And I also miss seeing people come into the lab and talking to people. I think that's the best way we can learn and inform our research. So I've been having some Zoom interviews with people with osteoarthritis, but it's just different than having that energy of being in person.
And Hannah, I'm curious, is the Stanford campus open now? Was it ever closed for a period of time?
Yeah, it is still open. I guess it's not open to the public. So actually they've gotten to the point where there are different zones that different students or faculty and staff can be in. And I think you're subject to being asked to show your ID at certain zones, and you've got to have all of these health checks covered if you're going to enter buildings and things like that. So being on campus, there's definitely a higher barrier to entry than there normally is. So I feel like that's the biggest thing that's probably changed. I mean, I had never thought of not going to campus before working from home. Before all this, I've always been, I think, like Melissa was saying, we love our lab space and getting to see everyone. It's really open, so you can kind of talk to anyone at any point. And a lot of some of the best ideas, I feel like, come up just at like the lunch table or like things like that. So I think that's been kind of a sad thing, but we're starting to be able to, the campus is starting to be more open, and I think they're now allowing some gatherings to occur and are slowly opening up as Santa Clara County, the county that we're in, is getting better COVID case-wise.
And has it affected if you're still taking classes for either one of you, has it affected how you take the classes as far as in-person versus Zoom sessions or smaller classes, even though for the most part, doctoral classes are typically fairly small?
Yeah, Hannah, I don't know. Do you take any classes right now? I've taken a few, and they're all done remotely right now. But what I've enjoyed is that I can take more classes, or I guess listen in on more classes. So most of them are recorded now. So now I've signed up for a lot of classes just because I find them interesting, and then I can go for a walk and just listen to it. And so I've actually found that to be a really positive part of classes going remote. But again, it's just hard to, I think, be interactive over Zoom. So that's been a bit of a challenge in classes.
And I know that one of the things, as we were chatting before we started recording, one of the reasons I do Moving2Live is everybody has a story. And often you see the title of somebody and just say, oh, she's a biomechanist, but you never realize that. And starting with you, Melissa, why biomechanics? What did you major in undergrad? And was there something that lit up? I mean, I know my intention when I entered college was I was either going to do athletic training or I was going to be a marine biologist. And then I took a marine biology class that was plant-based and absolutely hated it. And here I am multiple years after that. And I have an athletic training certification, but I'm actually an exercise physiologist. So I think finding out the stories of people is part of the reason that I do Moving2Live.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's a fun question. I think there's so many paths that led me to biomechanics from all different angles in my life. Although actually, if you look at my poster of what I wanted to do, I think from first grade, I wanted to be a rock star. That didn't happen. But one of the main reasons is actually I watched my grandmother had an arm prosthesis, and I watched that evolve from being just this really rigid, stiff plastic arm to a myoelectric prosthesis, which she could actually move with her mind. And I just thought that was incredible. And then my dad is a software engineer, my mom is a nurse, and I kind of fit somewhere in between that engineering and loving to work with people and improve people's health. So that was also a big encouragement to go into the field. And I've always been active, I think, similar to a lot of biomechanists. Being in sports are a big part of your life, and moving is a big part of your life. And so that just kind of leads to a general fascination about how we move and why we move, and having a lot of injuries. And so biomechanics was a good way to kind of dive into that a little bit more. I don't want to carry on, but I also feel like I should mention I went to a couple of women in engineering camps in Ohio, and those were really transformative and really inspiring. And I was really grateful for the opportunity to go to those at the University of Akron and then be able to work some of those camps later.
And did you major in biomechanics as an undergraduate also?
I did. I majored in biomedical engineering with the subcategory of biomechanics.
And Hannah, what about you? What was the story, or what's the path to being a PhD student in biomechanics?
Well, my story is a little bit different. I always love hearing Melissa's story, especially it starting with her grandmother and like their close relationship. And I don't think I knew that until we started podcasting. So I love hearing it every time because it was something I didn't necessarily know about Melissa until we started doing this podcast. But my story is a little different. I actually came from a college that didn't have an engineering school. So I was a biochemistry major in my undergrad and wanted to do something outside of like wet bench research that didn't feel very translational and I couldn't really get a tangible, human impact from what I was doing. So switching fields to bioengineering, I thought, oh, that seems like really practical. And I was really excited about the brain when I was switching fields. So I kind of came at it from like the brain side and being really interested in a lot of motor disorders that are, neuro related. So neurodegenerative disorders like ALS, Parkinson's, things I study now, and kind of understanding what's happening when movement goes wrong to better understand movement in general. And like Melissa, I'm also have been very active in my life. So I think the thought of not being able to move and not having control over things that or I should say, I take for granted a lot of the time, was just insane to me. And so if there was anything I could do to help combat that, that was sort of where my motivation to come into the field was. And I was just amazed that this field even existed. So it was super exciting.
And I know some people who listen to this may not be familiar with the terms biomechanics and bioengineering. So we can give you the opportunity, again, either Melissa or Hannah, explain what biomechanics is, or why the preferred term for most programs is bioengineering. Either one of you can jump in.
I think Melissa pointed at me. But
I'm happy. I think we're going to have to direct it. We're just going to start talking over.
So Hannah, what is bioengineering, and is biomechanics a subcategory of that, or are they basically like a lot of sports science related fields where it's sports science, sports medicine, kinesiology, depending on the school, and it's all actually the same thing?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think I actually remember when I was applying to grad school and telling people I wanted to do bioengineering, they were like, what? And I was like, oh, it's like, prosthetics, but I don't want to do that. And it's so funny because I think that I ended up in the field that's probably of bioengineering that's closest to that. But bioengineering, I just always say, is just a huge umbrella term for everything from cellular level engineering, like things like, and things like CRISPR that has sort of been in the popular media, genome editing, our DNA and genetic information, all the way up to sort of the macro things like we study of the human movement, and even prosthetics and exoskeletons and things like that. So I think biomechanics, I would say, is a subset of bioengineering, but it doesn't have to be. It's also a field on its own, I would say.
And it sounds like bioengineering can literally go the gambit from being very, very basic, or as you said, wet bench, all the way up to applied, and that both of you are interested more on the applied side, which I think is interesting. There's a conference that I go to with a good friend of mine from doctoral studies. And when you go to the poster session, he says, let's go look at the posters where 50% of them are, no kidding, I knew that. 40% of them are, who cares? And 10% of them are, oh, wow, that's really interesting. And it's that's kind of a stereotype, but it's interesting that 10% are the ones where you can actually look at it and see, oh, that's how, like you were mentioning, Melissa, with your grandmother, that's how that can actually be applied to prosthetics and improving the quality of somebody's prosthetic, which really can be life-changing for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really enjoyed that about bioengineering, this huge span. I mean, my roommates are both in bioengineering, and they study, bacteria, and they study stem cells, and then I'm studying human movement. So even just, the three of us span a huge range. And we host a National Biomechanics Day, which is, along with schools worldwide, there's one day a year where we all celebrate biomechanics. And it's really fun at Stanford to include this range of things like neuromechanics to cellular mechanics and then human movement, and really show this wide span of not just bioengineering, but also biomechanics.
We're talking with Melissa Boswell and Hannah O'Day. They are bioengineering doctoral students at Stanford and also podcasters. Anybody who's done a doctorate knows that there's always more things to do than you have time for. Some of the best advice was given to me by one of my committee members who said, look, you're going to have a list. You're never going to check everything off the list. And the sooner you accept that, the better off you're going to be. I'm 52 now. I think I was 48 or 49 before I realized those lists that I would keep at the various note programs, well, they're always going to be something on there, and they've never been to zero. So I'm curious because it seems that there are lots of people probably in the last 2 or 3 years who started podcasting. And there's two groups of people. They're the ones who just dive in and keep doing it, and you look at it, and it may not be every week, but there's a pretty consistent for 2 or 3 years, or there's a variety of podcasts. And then I forget what the statistics are, but if you look on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any of the other ones, there's a whole bunch of podcasts on there that haven't been updated. There hasn't been a new episode in, 18 months, 2 years. And I know one of the things that always irritates me when I use Overcast, which is the podcast listening app that I use, is, there's like these really good podcasts, like the women's basketball coach at Connecticut did a really good podcast where he interviewed really interesting people just across the spectrum. And then he stopped doing it. So why take on podcasting in addition to all those other doctoral things? And what was your major professor's thoughts or comments when you said, I want to start a podcast, or did you just do it and they still don't know?
No, he definitely knows. It started as an initiative. I was a student representative for the International Society of Biomechanics, and I was just thinking of ways that we could further build the community. It's a global community, and thinking of ways that we can disseminate information more, but also have fun and be able to share information with a laugh. And with Hannah, I talked to her about it because Hannah was really passionate about science communication, and Hannah and I are friends. And when I suggested it to her, she was all for it. She's also a yes-ander, so we always try to yes-and each other. But it's ended. So now we've almost finished 3 years. So we've been pretty consistent. We've got a lot of positive feedback from the community, and we're hoping. So now we also have a separate segment called Student Voices, where we let other students in the community just take over an episode and do whatever they want with it. So we're trying to make it also more of a community initiative versus something that we will continue to spearhead, and we hope that it will continue on even after maybe we'll hand it off to some other students.
I got to ask for both of you with podcasts, are you podcast listeners yourself? And if you are, what 1 or 2 podcasts in addition to Biomechanics on Our Minds are must listens for you? Well, we'll start with you, Hannah.
Sure. I actually wasn't a podcaster before Boom, which is kind of funny. And I think because I am just such a visual learner that sometimes podcasts or audiobooks just go right over in one ear, and I swear it really does go right out the other. But once we started Boom, I really felt like my brain was like forming these new connections. I was actually able to digest just purely audio content. So I think Boom has actually taught me a lot and helped me a lot in an area that I was not expecting. And as far as ones I would recommend, I think both Melissa and I really like this podcast called On Being with Krista Tippett. It's really different than a lot of the conversations or topics that I encounter on a daily basis, and sort of gets at the higher, more universal kind of life questions, and talks to some really amazing guests, experts all over the place in all different kinds of fields. So I think I like that one. And then outside that, I also listen to How I Built This, which is just, I think, kind of similar to Boom in that it's a lot of stories of kind of building something and different paths and careers and perspectives, and seeing sort of peeling back what's behind the success of some company or startup or something that you see, and getting at who is the person behind it.
And Melissa, I know you said when we were talking prior to recording, you said you were a podcast listener. A lot of people don't realize, if they just started listening to podcasts are really only about 12 or 15 years old. I mean, I remember when I first started listening, it was there was an outdoor podcast where they actually told stories. It was called Dirtbag Diaries. And I remember it was like 2007. It's still out there, actually. They do it periodically. And I remember it was like, you mean I can listen to this for free? And they tell all these neat stories. So if you can remember, when did you first learn of podcasts, or if you remember, what was the first podcast you listened to?
Wow. I don't know if I can remember the very first one. I think I started listening to audiobooks first. But those similar, I think those are harder to listen to, whereas podcasts are a little bit more, have a little bit more energy and are shorter clips. But I think On Being was the first podcast that I listened to. And now I listen to so many. I'm kind of obsessed with like self-help, self-improvement books and podcasts. So I love On Purpose by Jay Shetty, and I love The School of Greatness with Lewis Howes. And I think, yeah, what I just love about podcasts is it's just a conversation, and you just hear this other story from someone and gain all these insights. And that was another reason why I think we lean towards podcasts, is like, well, I love to talk to people, and it makes it easy too for people to listen on the go. Or we have people say that they're doing their lab work and can put on a podcast. So it's really accessible.
I know one of the podcasts that I find with my podcast, there's probably 35 or 40. And I would say of each of the podcasts, whatever they are, I probably listen to about 20% of them. So just for example, with Boom, when I start listening to Boom, I'll listen to about 20% of them, because the rest of them doesn't mean it's a bad podcast. It's just they don't interest me. But it's amazing if you keep those podcasts in your playlist. Like one of the podcasts that I subscribe to is Joe Rogan, which, yes, I'm jumping on the bandwagon. I don't listen to the mixed martial arts stuff because it doesn't interest me. I don't listen to the comedy, but I listened to, 2.5 or 3 hours about a year ago of him interviewing David Lee Roth, which if you told me I would listen to David Lee Roth, Van Halen, I'd say, yeah, there's no way. And what was really interesting is when I listened to this, I learned that his father was a renowned eye surgeon, and that had an influence on him. And I learned that he kayaked back in New York City, and I learned that he rock climbed in Yosemite. And it's like, so this guy that you think of, he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You think of this, he's just these hardcore rocker, did all these things. Like, that's pretty neat. And the other one that was really interesting is, I believe it was Tim Ferriss interviewed a famous psychologist. I believe it was the gentleman who did the Stanford prison study. And I should know his name, but I don't.
Oh, that's such an interesting story.
It is, but Tim Ferriss actually interviewed the scientist who did it, and it was amazing. Anybody who's taken an intro psych class has read about the Stanford prison study, and the other study I think everybody probably remembers is the pain study, where you're somebody in one room and somebody's in the other room. They answer a question wrong, and you think, and Melissa's tapping a shock thing. The gentleman who is the Stanford pain study researcher and that gentleman were in the same doctoral program together, which is these are these neat things that you learn with podcasting. So I'm curious with both of you, with the variety of podcasts that you listen to. Do you listen to every single episode of On Being, or just some of them?
Definitely just some of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I know for me, sometimes if I don't listen to a podcast for 3 or 4 weeks, it's like I feel guilty. It's like I should listen to this. It's like, well, no.
Yeah, then you get it backlogged, and then you're like, how am I going to have time to listen to all of these? But but then sometimes I'll go for a road trip and listen to like 8 episodes of TED Talks or whatever, and kind of catch up. But yeah, definitely not all of them, it's nice when podcasts release a lot of different ones where you can kind of pick and choose what resonates with you.
And I'm curious for either one of you, is there my girlfriend actually asked me this last night. She said, if you could interview anybody for Moving2Live or my local podcast, FitLab Pittsburgh, who would you interview? And I know, like I've got a friend who says he wants to interview Joe Rogan and somebody else. And it's like, I don't have a dream guest per se. I want somebody who's interested in what they do and does something that I don't know that much about, so I can learn more about it. I'm wondering with either Melissa or Hannah or both of you, is there somebody it's like, God, I want to get this person on Boom, or we're trying to get this person on Boom, or, boy, we'll really have made it? Or is it just kind of, we just want interesting people across the spectrum of biomechanics or bioengineering?
Hannah, do you have anyone off the top of your head?
I did say to Melissa the other day that we should start tagging. We post on Twitter when an episode is released, and I said that we should just start tagging Miley Cyrus in the Twitter post.
I was like, well, they wouldn't want to talk mechanics, but I think the cool thing is, like, I'm also not someone who really, I don't know, I like idolizes people. I love just hearing their stories, and sometimes just people surprise you with the stories that they have, where you just weren't expecting it. And so I think we just try to keep a variety of people on the show, and a lot of different backgrounds and people that live in different places. I was just thinking, like, I wish I could speak languages so I could even have more of a diversity of people on the show. And yeah, but I can't think of any one person. But if someone's listening and thinks of somebody that we got to put on the show, please holler at it.
And I'm also wondering with this, because partially I pick other people's minds. It's somebody that I look up to said, there are no new ideas. There's just a reuse or a recycling of somebody else's idea. You put a little tweak on it. Do you have lists of potential guests coming up? Like you make lists, you say, I want to interview this person or that person. I know for me, a lot of my activity is I do a lot of running and hiking with 2 Labradors. And that's when my thinking comes along, and I'll be in the middle of this, like, I should contact this person, or why haven't I thought about that? And I think the best example of that is there's a gentleman who does stuff related to biomechanics. I actually met him when I was at Auburn. He's a former U.S. national team cyclist, and he has the second oldest bicycle fitting company in the world. And I knew Paul, back when I was in doctoral studies, and every 3 or 4 years we'd connect with email. We'd ask each other a question on something, and it was like 8 months ago. It's like, why haven't I had Paul in the interview? And interestingly, the idea came from it in that I was listening to a podcast that he was interviewed for, and he mentioned me and what an impact I'd had on him. And I mean, it's just like, why haven't I interviewed Paul? So it's always, I have a long list of probably 40 or 50 people. Like, some of them have said, I can't do it now, contact me in 6 months. Some of them is like, I just have to figure out how to contact him. Some of them is like, at some point I want to do this. I'm wondering, for Boom, do you keep a list of potential guests that we need to contact this, or is it more a fly by the seat of the pants? Hey, we need to come up with an episode. Let's find somebody who's good.
I think it depends on how much we have going on in our life, but Hannah and I usually try to have a sit down about once a quarter and really make a list. But a lot of our inspiration comes from conferences and the awesome conversations we have and different presentations that we get really inspired by. And that's where a lot of our lists of guests come from.
And I know you said that one of your reasons for starting podcasting and for doing it is you wanted to basically get the word out on biomechanics and make people recognize that. For people who haven't listened to an episode of Boom yet, and they're listening to this podcast and they go, oh, I want to learn more about that. Are the guests, is it more along the lines of, first of all, you interview biomechanists, and second, you interview students? For the biomechanists or the people involved in bioengineering, is that something that anybody who's not in the field it's going to go right over their head? Or are they going to be able to take that and say, I understand how that is? Kind of like Melissa, when you were describing the insight that when your grandmother got the arm that she could control with her brain.
I think that we try to make conversations as sort of open and inclusive to anyone who might be listening. And it has been actually exciting that we've gotten some feedback from people who were either transitioning into the field or not even in the field at all. And we're really excited by listening to Boom and being able to digest some of the conversations going on and just at least get an introduction to some of the content. And that I think that was exciting for us, because we don't necessarily tell our guests to speak a certain way or explain things a certain way. But I think a lot of people on the show are just naturally gifted at communicating well and explaining things well. And similar to you were talking about your show notes, Ben, we do either in the intro or at the end of our podcast, try to give some notes on or clarifications on anything that happened. So I think we try to make it as accessible as we want, because that's really what we want it to be.
And a lot of the questions we ask too are less technical, I would say. We always like to ask how they got interested in the field and what they're most excited for the future. We also talk a lot about failures and learning from failures and making those fun. So I think we also tend to not dive too deep. A lot of our questions, because Hannah and I are also learning as we go along. We're not experts in their particular subject area either. So a lot of the times the questions are more like, well, what are the applications of that? Or what does that mean? How do you see that affecting people? So we also try to ask questions that are, we ask questions like that because we don't know ourselves a lot of the time the specifics of the research.
And then when you have the students on, what was the impetus behind saying, I want to have students on? And are these all doctoral students in bioengineering, or do you go across the spectrum, master's degree, et cetera? And I like the fact that you're both on screen and able to point at one another, so I don't have to repeatedly say, you do this or do that. You guys are communicating very well. That's the visual learning that you were talking about, Hannah, when you initially didn't like podcasts.
Yeah, we miss being next to each other where we can just like poke each other to like, you go or you go. But yeah, the reason behind Student Voices was just to shine a light on other students. We go to a conference and we meet so many amazing students, and we're like, you should talk about that. You should host your own episode. And so that was really the reason behind it. And it's a whole spectrum. So it's been everyone from undergrads to graduate students and postdoctoral researchers. So we've had a wide range of students that we interview, and then students who also decide to interview somebody in the field too. So it's also a good opportunity for a student to use the platform as a means of connecting with somebody in the field. And because they're usually more than willing to talk with them.
Any additional plans to expand out on the podcast and do more things, or just continue to do the same, interviewing a variety of guests in the field and also having the student voices?
Recently, Hannah and I talked about, I think something we're going to do is this little minute of motivation or something, just a couple minute episodes that are really short, that is just some tip for grad school or life that we've learned, and just kind of some bits of happiness, because we love to just put a smile on people's faces. And so that's something we're looking forward to. We just, in terms of expanding, it's kind of just, we haven't planned too much. It's just been evolving as we go along, and we've had a lot of ideas from other people that we've gone with and have worked out really well. We just have a merch shop now, so things are getting pretty exciting with that.
I know, but the story I have to tell with that, with our local podcast, the two stories, we do FitLab Pittsburgh, and I walked into a local bike shop wearing a FitLab Pittsburgh t-shirt because we have merch too. And one of the mechanics goes, "Oh, I listened to that. Did you know that?" And I was able to say, "I am FitLab Pittsburgh," which was kind of cool.
Yes, but you've made it.
So, yes,
made it.
I've made it. But the better story, that's kind of the backwards brag. But the better story, I mentioned that I do a lot of running and hiking with two Labradors. And what we do for FitLab Pittsburgh, our local one, because again, the ethos is movement is a lifestyle, not just an activity, is every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we do a 1-minute movement tip lifestyle hack that we publish on YouTube and all the social media channels. I mean, maybe it's something easy like, don't wear cotton socks when you run, or, it's a quick recipe, or just an idea, and usually there's a Labrador in the background, chewing on a stick or something. And there's been 2 instances where I've been running someplace and somebody's come up to me and said, "I know you, I recognize those Labradors. Those are the FitLab Pittsburgh Labradors." So my Labradors are more knowledgeable or better known than I am. And like the first time, the second time there was a guy, he's coming off the hill and he's yelling, Ben, Ben. I'm like, I don't know this guy. And he's like, "I recognize those Labradors." So you'll find if you
That is so funny. Yeah, one time we've been at conferences where people have come up and been like, "I recognize your voice." Like it's, so that's been kind of funny. But our fame is very limited to biomechanics conferences. But maybe one day it will be walking on the street and someone will recognize us.
I just want to become as well recognized as my dogs. That's my goal. We've been talking to Melissa Boswell and Hannah O'Day. They are bioengineering doctoral students at Stanford University. They also have the podcast Boom, Biomechanics on Our Mind. We've had an interesting conversation. We're going to have extensive show notes where you'll be able to find the link to Boom, and they'll provide the link to the Boom merch too. So if you want to have some biomechanics related merch, Hannah and Melissa, I want to thank you for taking time to talk to Moving2Live. We really are appreciative, and I think it's a great example of being able to break down knowledge silos and make people recognize that even complex things like bioengineering are very closely related to everyday life.
Thanks so much for having us. This has been so awesome. And I feel like I've learned a lot about podcasting just from seeing how you conduct the interview, how you facilitate questions, and just your super, of course, now I'm not being, what's the word I want? Eloquent. I wasn't being eloquent, but your eloquence.
Articulate.
It's been really awesome. Articulate. There we go. But so thank you so much for having us. This has been super fun, and for your dedication to such an awesome podcast and breaking down those silos, because I think that's the only way that we can really move forward.
Yeah, we really appreciate you, and also for shining a light on our podcast and for chatting with us. It's been such an experience. I texted Hannah. I was like, "This. I'm so nervous right now. Just being on the other side. It's easier, I think, to ask the questions than to be the one answering. So this is a really good experience for us too, to be on the other side. So gain a little bit of empathy for the people that we're talking with. But yeah, we appreciate it. It's been fun talking."
And I think to anybody who's listening, I mean, I think it's normal to be nervous. I tell everybody who, before the interview, when they say I'm nervous or they say, I don't know if I want to do that, if you're interested in what you do, it shows through. And it may not be the most articulate. There may be ums and ers, but if you're interested, it shows through. And that's what the listeners want. And in instance of both of you, very clearly, you have a solid reason for being in the bioengineering field. And I think your stories exemplify that. So again, for Moving2Live, thank you very much. Thanks for listening to the latest episode of Moving2Live. Make sure you check out the show notes for contact information for our latest guest, as well as links about all the things we talked about. Intro and exit music is Traveling Light by Jason Shaw. You can subscribe to Moving2Live on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and Google Play, and be notified about new episode releases. Have any questions, comments, or suggestions? Drop us an email, mov2liv@gmail.com. Connect with us on Twitter or Instagram, both _MOV2LIV. Please tell your friends about Moving2Live. It's a go-to place for information for movement and exercise professionals and amateur aficionados who understand that movement is part of what makes your life complete. Until next week, keep on moving.